And Cengiz, we're ready for you to hear about your dashboard and some more information about your survey.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope James is with us as well. I know Georgie might potentially be not available. Hi, James.
Hello.
So I'm just looking at it before I share the screen. It's just, yeah, well, I guess we kind of expected. It's only two stories, two experiences, two people participated. Maybe some others are actually are in the process of still filling in and moving those dots in those triads and dyads. But certainly, at least we've got some material to share with you, because we started the study in May. And I think one reality is the survey fatigue, and also the other reality is COVID-19. So I even question, like, in such tough times, difficult times, they're asking people to complete more and more surveys. But it's also, there's the argument that if we're not going to be able to capture what's happening on the at the coal face on the line today, then how are we going to really understand what's happening? And of course, the typical ways of looking at FDM data, the ASRs and MORs and other stuff. So I think those kind of things have already been discussed by various other speakers this morning, yesterday, and certainly the FDM element has always been a very robust way of identifying certain issues. But just like we said earlier on this morning, is to also try to look at things, how we can supplement and complement the existing data sources. So I'm conscious of, you know, well, it's only two people, that's fine, but maybe I should share my screen and start sort of maybe show you some of the stuff from the dashboard from the previous responses. And I guess along the way, you know, please do chip in, continue to ask questions, and Rob, we would welcome any questions as we go along, rather than we keep talking. Does that make sense? Is that a reasonable approach?
Oh yeah, sure. That's a shame we only got two. I think possibly the audience maybe is safety people, perhaps not operational, so that might explain it.
Okay, fair enough. I guess I'm just looking at James, and do you have immediate observations, not only today's data, but also in general? Because I have some observations. I looked at literally line by line, and obviously with very limited number of people's responses, ideally the way that SenseMaker works is you've got good volume of data, and then those patterns emerge. But I'm going to turn these into a word cloud, because sometimes we're also conscious of the way that we filter data, and then there's a story pops up, and despite the fact that we ask people not to mention companies' names and within the narratives and so on, sometimes there are those cases. So we don't want to be seen as, here we go, that we were actually presenting a case against a particular organization or so. But James, do you have any views about how the data overall, when you looked at that, varies these patterns? So this is what the dashboard looks like. We can easily filter these things in and out. I can only, for example, look at the events within the last 1 to 3 years, and then that gives me a different picture in some of these. I can take that filter out, and then as you can see, you see the different picture. But and again, making sense is always a human element rather than just looking at patterns or visualizations or quantification. Do you have any generic observations, James? I'd like to share one, particularly related to flight data monitoring.
Sorry, yeah, so I sent you some today.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to find. So keep
That's okay.
talking for a minute. And I'll,
okay, let me share my observation. It's only 90 people or less than 90 people responded so far, but certainly those people, the frontline pilots responding to survey, I'm not saying, I'm not even giving you a percentage, but then again, sometimes, yes, quantification is important, but actually somebody says something and we know that that's not across the industry, but that's actually a pattern in certain organizations. So basically, what is a sort of response from some pilots and saying the FDM data being used to look at some operational performances, but also our own decisions as pilots, and then used against us. So in other words, single engine taxiing, the fuel burn, the fuel decisions that we make, and the companies actually using the FDM data to identify these things and then come back and puts pressure on us. So I don't know if you have any comments from any other people, any other panelists this morning on the call. And I think that's sad. And I made some recent comments on some of the postings. I think John posted something on one of the EASA publications about FDM being a great tool, which is absolutely true. But in the wrong hands or in the different mindsets. And I think it is sad that we're hearing that the FDM data being used as not expected. I don't know if any, let me throw that in the air and if anyone has any views or comments.
Yeah, by all means, please chip in if you've got some experience of FDM being misused. I'm Cengiz, I know from my own experience that there was an occasion where the pilots had a particular practice which was outside of the SAPs, but it was around overtime payments, and the company wanted to use FDM to monitor this, and I resisted it. It could quite easily. There were other ways to watch for it, which they ultimately adopted. But if you're going to use FDM, first of all, we've been talking about communication. If there's a standard that you want people to operate to, you communicate that standard, and you tell them that FDM is being used so that it's visible, transparent, and upfront, and then you don't get comments like you've received there, where FDM is being used to spy on us without our knowledge. That's absolutely not what it's for, and it completely undermines confidence in the whole program. And then, of course, you lose the safety benefits once that happens. So you can't really compromise on that. But anything, so you obviously have your standard operating procedures and your aircraft flight manual limitations, and those are monitored by flight data. That's what we normally do, and everybody understands that. But if you start monitoring for other things, you could, but you have to be visible, transparent, and communicate it, and so that everybody understands that's what's happening, and how that will then be used, so that everyone's in the loop, but not for sneaking around and spying on people.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's almost driving a wrong behavior, isn't it? That sort of people say, I'm continuing, and literally league tables, and first officers sometimes saying, well, I asked this, and again, I don't want to say first officers against captains, but certainly there's those kind of scenarios and experiences shared and saying, well, I suggested this as a sort of taking some fuel, and then the captain's decision was completely opposite because he was concerned about being in the being monitored and being in the league table. And it is, it begs the question that some of these practices about monitoring, not only looking at the safety reasons, but also looking at creating league tables and also driving behavior in different ways. It's influencing, isn't it? Influencing the decision making in the operational environment. But if I may just very briefly just show one or two things in this dashboard. Again, we're not trying to promote the product itself, but I think that it's got some strengths. No doubt that it's got some limitations. So the first thing we can, by designing, I guess design is a fundamental element. What kind of questions that we want to probe, we want to ask people. So what we did, for example, we asked people to say, look, what about the decision? Who influenced the decision? But then who made the decision? Because during the decision-making process, you may actually get people sometimes influenced by the management. So I can actually look at these by filtering these out. Then it would give me, even though management influenced the decision, who made the final decision. In some cases, management overwritten and made the final decision, but there are also examples that individuals taking their decisions. If I want to look at those, there's 6 scenarios, for example. Management tried to influence the decision and then individuals made the final decision. I can then literally go, and I don't want to turn this into a list so that we can see the scenarios. As I said, in some cases, we've got even company names and so on, and that's why I'm cautious. But with the beauty of it is you can then go and read literally the narrative shared by people. And of course, then you can look at it in a completely different way. This is typically like you do with a flight data or any data like other data tools like Tableau and so on. So, but one other thing that, for example, which emerged, which is also a good outcome, I guess, people shared a lot of stories that they actually strictly stayed with the rules, within the rules. And then once you actually filtered these in, and then you can have a look at who made the decision, what kind of sort of this other question, for example, the specific situation could have been improved by either changes to the process practice or technology or actually people's skills. If you're interested in people's story, then you can further filter that out, and then you can go and read those narratives. And we tried to design these triads and dyads, and if I take those out, and if I want to look at, for example, the safety aspect of it, whether the operational, and if I'm looking at 91 responses and refresh that, see if there's any more.
A minute, I think.
Now we've got 92, maybe one more. For example, take a look at this one. In the decision that was made, it was also sort of safety or operational. So it's almost, there are some pockets of people just taking, putting the operational goals in front as a priority, and you can go and look at those, or you can take that out, filter that out, and actually go and look at what are those stories that people actually put safety as a priority. And then of course you can then look at with these different dyad questions. So I think the dashboard functionality gives you not only looking at dyads, triads, filter things in and out and cutting and slicing the data in different ways, but then the ultimate aim is to go and look at those real meaningful stories and experiences that people shared. James, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think you've done a lot of that. That's quite good. The other part was the workbench section. I don't know if you're going to go through that, because I pulled a couple out on the graphs that it produces in workbench.
Let me just
go back to the engagement.
So the dash engagement, and then in here, isn't it?
Yeah,
I've got quite a few different stories. Yeah. So here, this one.
Yeah, it must be. That's right. Takes a minute to load this.
So while you're doing that, so as I understand it from what James and Josie told us this morning, our environment is a complex environment. Would that be?
So no, it's split into elements. So the domains. So there's the order domain, which is clear and complicated. So clear is really easy. Complicated is stuff we know is going to work. So jet engines or whatever, they're methodical and cause and effect are linked. And then there's elements of the operation that are complex, where cause and effect starts to break down and it's not so obvious.
Okay,
and we have to start thinking about how we deal with decision making in that environment, because to put in rigid controls within a complex in parts of the operation, you start causing problems.
I understand that. So the aviation system is made up of elements which fit into those categories.
So, and we hope that most of it is in the order domain now, because we've got on top of it very much ordered most of it. But there are always going to be elements that we can't control. So,
Then from the survey, Joji was talking about how you make sense of it and how you problem solve and the reasoning that you use to get to that decision, perhaps. That's what you're trying to tease out through this survey.
So this survey in the complex arena, if you start using more traditional methods of data capture, you already start to look for things that you think might be a problem, whereas this goes straight to the frontline operators who see these problems emerging. So the safety issues in the complex environment are in the main emergent properties. So they're in the same way you plant an apple seed and it becomes a tree. You don't know what the taste of the apples are going to be until they've grown, because there's so many different factors affecting it. In the same way, safety is the same thing. It will pop out strange stuff that you don't know is going to happen. But what happens in general is these things tend to occur many times before, but they're not amplified by consequence, so they're not picked up. But frontline operators see this stuff all day. So when there's an accident, there's usually about 20 people say, oh, well, you knew that was going to bloody happen because we've seen all this stuff happen before. So this is sort of picking up on the weak signal detection system that we'd all like to see. I think it's going towards that direction.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just share maybe one other thing that I think which was discussed earlier this morning. I'm just going to pick out one slide that I used in the previous. So maybe this one. So back in 2016, and basically, 7,000 plus pilots were surveyed. And the good news is it was only 5%. It wasn't 50%. But actually, most of them, and this was a survey of about 50, 60 different questions in Likert scales. And people also recognize that not too many, but certainly 300 some pilots, 360 plus pilots, actually ticked the box and said, we often have to deviate from procedures for safety reasons. So in other words, yesterday there were some interesting discussions about LOSA, what does error mean, and what does error mean in LOSA, and what does error in general. And I think, it all depends how you define it, but equally, we do need to recognize, I think, personally, and you may disagree with me, that we will never be able to develop SOPs to cover every eventuality in this complex system people operate. So we do need, let me just make this absolutely clear. I don't promote the idea that people should deviate from procedure every day. I don't promote that at all. Let me be absolutely clear. But at the same time, if we just don't fully understand what are those circumstances, people look at the circumstances that they face, and it makes sense to them that they deviate. And there are examples of those cases in our survey. If I may just go back and again, I don't want to share the actual narrative, but maybe we can share these with in our ultimate. Let me just do this quickly. So if you look at it, and some people actually literally did say, here's our deviate slightly from the procedures, right? So people do recognize that it did make sense to them to deviate because the SOP's design didn't cover the circumstances they faced. And I think I shared one with you, Rob, that they ended up going into a destination. In fact, it was a destination in Turkey. And the company didn't have any guidance, anything at all, for a non-precision approach. And then they made their own judgment and did a circling, and they just, followed whatever that made sense to them. And it happened to other people, which caused an unstabilized approach. And then they raised ASRs, and then the company reacted to that and actually provided some guidance. If the ILS didn't work, how would they do? And it was actually a quite challenging destination. There's a few of them in Turkey. They're surrounded by sort of terrain and so on. But the key point, I guess, the learning point from that is why would the company, and again, I'm not pointing fingers to the company or management at all, but if you're flying to that destination, and if you're not a business aviation company, you might just fly one-off. If you're flying that as sort of, why didn't you in the first place that actually created a procedure SOP that if the ILS is unserviceable, people will end up then carrying out a non-precision approach. But it came out of the stories, and also it came out by people raising the ASRs and so on. But I guess proactively, the company could have provided that non-precision approach for that particular destination in the first place. I don't know if I'm making any sense to talk to all the pilots as an engineer.
There's an interesting point in there that the until it's amplified by consequence, then these things aren't usually picked up by the ASR system.
Exactly.
Which is why surveys like this work quite well. Also, on the point you made about errors earlier on, the problem with errors and people is that errors are almost impossible to pick up until they're amplified by consequence. So when people, and it seems obvious when you look back because of retrospective coherence, which we spoke about earlier, but people won't pick up their own errors. It's almost impossible to do so, and they certainly won't report their own errors. But what they will do is say that I had to deviate here, as Cengiz said, I have to deviate from procedures to rescue this, and then you can start picking up those occurrences and start to see where your system is producing a context where pilots have to deviate from procedures, and then you can either develop a procedure around it or mitigate it in some other way, build some resilience into the system. So it's a good weak signal detection system, this, which is what we're using it for here anyway. It has lots of other uses, but in that complex environment, properties are emergent, so you can't predict in advance what they're going to be, which is why risk management can't be the full story.
Yeah. And take a look at this one. In this diad, there's a group in here somewhere in the center, and basically we just said to people, do you rigidly follow the procedures, or do you sometimes totally trust your judgment? And clearly then you can again take a look at these, and there's a group, filter them in and go and then look at those particular narratives. It's only 5 of them, but obviously if you have the mass volume of data, then you're going to look at some interesting stories people are sharing. Again, this was also maybe a little bit driven by me. Originally, I was fascinated by this idea that aeronautical decision making can be much more complex, because you'd end up with making split-second decisions whether to go around or not. But if you had plenty of time to make a decision whether you should go and fly tomorrow morning or not, even though you're fatigued, at least you're in a different state than making split-second decisions. And that's why we, for example, ask people, are you making quick decisions, or are you actually sometimes extremely quick or extremely slow decision-making process? Because if you've got plenty of time to make that decision, you might go and seek further data, evidence, look at further analysis.
Yeah, interestingly on that, if you highlighted the extremely quick section, they all come out as safety decisions and none of them are commercial decisions, which is what you'd expect to see. So the data kind of backs up what you're expecting. But the other beauty of this software is that you can see the stories around them. Yeah, you can see moved. That's right.
The actual narrative. Yeah,
oh, no,
basically these.
Yeah, but you can and you can bring them up from the points on that dashboard. But you can start to see groups of where people are that you don't want them to be, and groups where people are where you do want them to be. And you can ask the question, how do I get less stories like this and more stories like this? And it gives you an immediate decision-making tool on how you can start to move people away from things that you don't like towards things you do like. And you can do that because there'll be people in between. So if they're so far apart, it's a true nudge
theory.
tool rather than a boot up the arse tool, which is I want you from here to here. You can find stories in between and start to nudge people in the right direction. And of course, you can filter stories by time, so you can see a progress of movement of how the groups of people are moving away from where you want them not to be and towards where you want them to be. So it's a really good decision-making tool in complex environments.
I mean, if I may just also, sorry, it's a little bit me, my sort of idea. This whole risk framework, risk decision or risk behavior framework was originally influenced by Haddon Cave. So the idea is asking people, if there was a risk decision involved, either an assessment or even a mitigation decision, then how would you see? So take a look at this. If I filter all of these out, and most of the people think that they're all making risk sensible decisions. And you might just, people say, oh, it's stating the obvious. Yes, it is stating the obvious, but I would also question this, because if you then, people are just thinking that most of the decision that they made would have been seen closer to what they think by their co-workers, colleagues. But then when you ask them the same question, what they think that the management see about those risks and scenarios, there is this pocket of people are just saying management is actually ignorant about these decisions or about those risks. And then you can actually go and see the narrative. And amongst them, some interesting discussions, because I'm not saying for a minute that, it's people's judgment and their perception. But if the leadership is not curious about these kind of scenarios, I think, or let me put it this way, a bit more positive. I think if the leadership at SRB level is curious about those kind of scenarios, then there's a learning point. And people may think that they're making risk sensible decisions, but if people in the SRB actually looks at those scenarios and say, actually, they're not very sensible decisions. We don't want our people to make those kind of decisions. We want them to be go in this direction or that direction, like James mentioned. And I'm conscious of time, we're coming to the end, but I just want to make one more point. So I think the earlier point Connor was making also about the feedback. So the feedback element is certainly an interesting one, because there's always this challenge of survey fatigue, but it's also even within the organization, I keep reporting and how much I'm getting out of all of this. And so one thing that, again, I'm not promoting the tool, but the tool also has an app. So the idea is they're thinking about, and they haven't announced it yet, but I recently came across a discussion about it. So the idea is, if I'm sharing my experience and going through this kind of survey, and it doesn't have to be this many questions, it can be even reduced numbers, but I'm sharing my own experience, my own story. And the idea is the app, via app, for you to be able to see similar stories. So in other words, there's immediate sort of encouragement of the sort of frontline personnel to be able to say, okay, I'm sharing my experience, but also I'm allowed to see others making similar decisions or facing similar challenges, and I want to hear their stories as well, or I want to even know what kind of decisions that they're making. So I think that's again, I'm reflecting on some of the things that I've heard this morning. That's a kind of individual level learning in the organization, because people can start sort of learn from each other by reflecting on each other's experiences.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And just prior to that, when you were talking about the frontline staff think the management are risk ignorant or even risk cavalier, it brought me back to that conversation you had earlier, where the captain told the first officer that he was taking the fuel because of the league table. Now, I'm pretty sure that flight ops management team don't want fuel decisions based on that. They want objective decisions based on NOTAMs and weather, tech status of the airplane. If you need it, take it. If you don't need it, don't take it.
Absolutely.
And I think there's somewhere between the two, there's a breakdown there, right? Which ends up with people thinking that management are risk cavalier or risk ignorant. Now they may well be, but I would hazard a guess that it's rarer than that chart is showing.
I think it's where the incentives are lying as well. So if you've got that league table system, people are inclined to not take the fuel. They're inclined to take more of the risk because they're up on a league table.
Yeah, well, that's
So,
that's
you
not
don't
the
want to
intended
incentivize that.
consequence.
Yeah.
But just one last point, I just want to reiterate that the purpose of either the framework or the tool or even the survey is not to try to be divisive. Is actually it's a conversation starter. People talked about earlier on conversations. So if we can actually start having that dialogue and say, okay, I made this decision, and we may not necessarily agree on every decision or every behavior that everyone is going to be exactly, because we're all human beings. But if we start that dialogue with some level of experience sharing and some level of facts and data, then at least we can have a dialogue about what kind of how can we make more informed, risk-based, better decisions, I guess.
Yeah. And Cengiz, is this just for the recovery from the pandemic, or are you going to keep it going as ongoing?
Well, my aim is hopefully I can convince Joji and James and others in Balpa or everywhere else. So I think the more we kind of use this kind of approach to supplement the existing data sources, the better it is. So the idea is to continue certainly collect data. By the way, there is actually a bursary draw for a Cranfield course, so please do share as many as you can. Sorry, but it's actually I'm not selling, I'm just offering something literally for a course opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I mean, next year when we hold the seminar next year, we'll hopefully have a face-to-face element and also stream it in the background as well.
Yes.
But if we do that, Cengiz, and you bring it along, at least if we've got the people in the room, we can withhold their lunch until they complete your survey, so we get a few more in there.
I just have a point to make there on from the Balpa side of continuing the conversation. We have a safety course that we run for our safety reps, which is mainly around what we talked about today, the areas of complexity and positioning safety theory in how they operate within our airline environments. And we're thinking of offering that to outside personnel as they wish on a free basis. So if somebody wants to continue the conversation in that way, they could get in touch with us. And it's about a 4 or 5 hour course that we can do online or in person. So,
what's it called, James?
well, at the moment it's developed for our safety reps, so it's just a basic flight safety course. But we were thinking of expanding it outside the doors to continue the conversation if somebody's interested in learning more about complexity and the domains that they create safety within.
Okay, yeah, if you send us the details, we can pass that on.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So where are we time-wise? 3 minutes past 2. So I think we'll wrap that up there. No more questions. So thank you, Cengiz and James and Joji. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Interesting study, I think.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Very welcome, and it'd be interesting to see. It would be interesting to see a bit more of it later on, perhaps even next year when you've got a bit more data in there and see what it shows. So anyway, thank you very much for your time, and we're going to move to Mark Ford now, who's